Good evening, everyone. Uh, Today, I'll be presenting the two articles in the Journal Club. The title of the first article is the first article is published in Nature on 13th this month, and it was from a group based in Belgium. The title was Local Immune Response to Food Antigens Drives Meal Induced Abdominal Pain. So, coming to background, uh, 20% of the general population develop GI symptoms following meal, and this meal-induced pain or postprandial symptoms lead to significant amount of morbidity and reduced quality of life, and also contributing to significant healthcare costs. We know that IBS is a debilitating and difficult to treat condition, and there are no curative therapies as of now. So, to understand the pathophysiology of IBS, this study was undertaken, and we know that the gut mucosa maintains a physical as well as an immunological barrier to all the food antigens we take daily, and you know, and this helps in maintenance of intestinal homeostasis and prevents unnecessary immune response to the benign food antigens. We know post-infectious IBS is a known entity, and infectious gastritis is a risk factor for IBS. Up to 30% of patients with infectious gastroenteritis go on to develop new onset IBS, and up to 17% of patients with IBS report that their symptoms started after GI infection. Altered pain perception or visceral hypersensitivity is a hallmark of IBS, and recent literature has shown that this visceral hypersensitivity was associated with increased activation, and regranulation of mast cells in the mucosa, intestinal mucosa. So, what are the gaps they are trying to address in this study? What stimuli are responsible for activation of mast cells in IBS, especially in response to food intake? And what are the mechanisms of food induced abdominal complaints? So, to answer these questions, they have formulated a hypothesis where they postulated that a bacterial infection of the GI tract will lead to breakdown of oral tolerance to food antigens, and subsequently paving the way for food induced visceral hypersensitivity, which is responsible for postprandial symptoms. So coming to methods, they have done a series of experiments in the mice, which are preclinical studies, and a small clinical study as well. So for mice experiments, I'll be explaining the methods and the results simultaneously, because if I explain the methods, all the methods here, it will be confusing. For clinical human experiment, they have taken healthy volunteers through a public advertisement, and the inclusion criteria were that these volunteers should not have any GI symptoms, should not have undergone any GI surgery, or should not be on any uh, GI medication. So the IBS patients who are fulfilling the Rome 3 criteria were recruited from OPD of University Hospital Leuven, and trained allergologists have screened these patients and ruled out that these patients are not allergic to the common food antigens like soy, milk, gluten, or wheat. These were done with skin prick tests and other tests also. So they have conducted food antigen injection into the rectosigmoid mucosa of both healthy volunteers and IBS patients. They have tested the mast cell trypsin-like activity, and they have taken the stool samples and identified the bacteria which were isolated, and they have also collected biopsy from the rectosigmoid area and uh, subjected it to immunofluorescence staining. So different numbers were recruited for these series of experiments. So coming to the results of the preclinical studies, they have taken albino mice, 6 to 7 week old mice. So this is the study protocol in the mice. What they have done is they have first measured the vasomotor response at the baseline, and subsequently they've infected these mice with Citrobacter rodentium by feeding it through drinking water. And once the mice is infected, these mice were followed for up to 7 to 8 weeks. So they kept measuring the vasomotor response at 2 weeks after the infection, 4 weeks after the infection, and 6 and 7 weeks after the infection. So how they measured the vasomotor response, I'll be discussing subsequently. Here, during the infection, they have given the food antigen, which is ovalbumin here. Subsequently, I'll call it as OVA for simplicity. So they have exposed the patients to exposed the mice to ovalbumin, which is a food antigen, immediately after the during the course of infection, and they have also re-exposed the same mice to the same food antigen again by giving them through oral gavages. Oral gavages, they have placed a tube in the duodenum and they have given ovalbumin. So they have given 10 sessions of oral gavages of re-exposure with every alternate day, starting from 5 weeks after the infection. That means by this time the infection is resolved, and now here they have re-exposed the food antigen to look for any uh, uh, symptoms following the antigen re-exposure. So this is the experimental protocol, and instead of ovalbumin, they in for experimental purpose they have given saline as a control group. Instead of infection, they have used sham groups. Instead of over re-exposure, they have given saline in another group. So with these combinations, there are multiple combinations that can be found. For example, the mice infected with Citrobacter rodentium, while exposing them to ovalbumin in the drinking water, this will be termed as ova-infected mice. So infected with Citrobacter and exposed to ovalbumin simultaneously during the infection. Subsequently, these mice who are re-infected, re-exposed to ova, they will be termed as ova-infected plus ova. So these terms are important because all the subsequent graphs they will show these results will be based on these terminology. So it is important that we understand this terminology. So as I said, after clearance of infection, 5 weeks after infection, repeated oral gavage, that is nothing but ova re-exposure. So this is ova infected plus ova. This is the acronym. Otherwise, they can be saline or sham or saline again. So coming to the results, they've placed the mice in metal cage and they've measured the fecal, they collected the fecal pellets, and um, they have estimated the water content in the feces. Not just the water content, they also gave, similar to the Bristol stool chart, they've also formulated a simpler chart with 4-point chart, and from 1 to 4. So they have, what they have observed were the diarrheal scores were increased. uh, so just a second, sir.
Jatin, are you there?
Sir, I apologize for the delay.
Jatin,
So
you should explain the should explain the graphs here.
yes, sir.
There are two groups which are being experimented. One is ova sham plus ova and ova infected plus ova.
Yes,
Just
sir.
explain what those two groups are.
Yes, sir. So here we can see that if you can remember the protocol that I've just explained. Here, instead of infection, they have taken sham. So these are two groups who are infected and exposed to ovalbumin and re-exposed to ovalbumin, and another where there is no infection. In simpler terms, these are infected mice and these are non-infected mice who are exposed to the albumin in two different time points. So these mice were observed from the baseline at the time of infection, and this is after the re-exposure. So x-axis represents the timeline, and y-axis in the first is the water content, and second is the whole gut transit time. So what are the key findings? They found that once the infection is resolved after re-exposure to the same food antigen, there were increase in the diarrheal scores. Uh, as I said, using simpler scores, and they also found that there was increase in the fecal water content, and also the transit time has reduced, and the fecal water content has increased, especially in the later part after re-exposure. So this establishes the fact that there was diarrhea with over re-exposure after GI infection. This is in simpler terms of post-infectious IBS diarrhea predominant type of a model. So to understand the pathophysiology of this post-infectious IBS, they have estimated over specific IgE antibodies, and so here again there are 5 different types of mice models that are available. So this is over allergic mice. So these mice have systemic food allergy to ovalbumin, and these patients have high antigens over specific immunoglobulin antibodies in colon, in intestine, as well as serum. So these mice have systemic allergy, so they have antibodies even in the serum. But in contrast to that, all other experimental mice who were not allergic to albumin, who were infected and injected with ovalbumin, they did not demonstrate any immunoglobulin in the serum, but they have demonstrated immunoglobulin in the colon. What does this imply? This implies that the immune response mounted to this food antigen is restricted to the colon, which is the site for colonization of Citrobacter, but these were not found in serum or small intestine. So to prove the same fact, what they've done was they intradermally injected this albumin into these 4 groups of mice. So the first group is the sham mice. Second group, the initial exposure was saline. Third group, the re-exposure was saline. Fourth group, which is the model of interest, which is the IBS model, where ova infected with ova re-exposure. Sorry, after intradermal injection, they found that mice with food allergy had ear swelling, but not the post-infectious IBS models, where they did not demonstrate any systemic effects of allergy. So second, now that we have established that there is diarrhea and there was local immune response, second, now we are talking about the altered pain perception. So altered pain perception, we cannot demonstrate the pain scores in mice. So as a surrogate to pain, they have taken visceromotor response. So what is visceromotor response? So they have placed arterial embolization Fogarty catheters in the colon, and they have injected saline through it, like 20, 40, 60, and 80 microliters of saline they have injected. As a response to distension of the colorectum, there is contraction of the uh, mice abdominal muscles. So this contraction of the muscles were measured by placing the electrodes were sutured to the external oblique muscle of the mice, and the transmitters were placed in the abdominal cavity. So with that, they have measured the muscle contraction. So this muscle contraction, this abdominal cramping, which was evoked in response to colorectal distension, was recorded by the electrodes. And this when there is increased pain response to same amount of colorectal distension, this is termed as visceral hypersensitivity. So here, whether the altered immune response leads to visceral hypersensitivity. So in the y-axis, we can see that this is the visceromotor response. So this is the timeline after infection. This is re-exposure, and this is the primary exposure to albumin. So initially, during the first 2 weeks, there is increase in the visceral hypersensitivity, which settles down by 4 weeks. But after re-exposure of ovalbumin, here again the same 4 groups, as I've explained previously. So ova infected plus ovalbumin. This is the post-infectious model. These are the control groups. So this subsequently I'll be calling these as VHS mice for simplicity. So these VHS mice, I'm calling them VHS mice because these group demonstrated higher vasomotor response to same amount of colorectal distension compared to all other 3 groups. So this establishes the fact that exposure to some albumin during infection and subsequently re-exposing them to the same antigen led to development of increased vasomotor response, or nothing but the visceral hypersensitivity. So as I said, after infection, transient period of increased pain response was there for the first 2 weeks, and re-exposure resulted in VHS only in the infected mice who were re-exposed to ovalbumin. And once they've stopped the re-exposure and they've continued to measure the visceral hypersensitivity, this visceral hypersensitivity persisted up to 4 weeks after the last oral gavage. So if we stop the ovalbumin re-exposure, the VHS continued to persist for at least 4 weeks. So what they've done was instead of so here this was the first time that the mice have been exposed to ovalbumin. So it is possible that it will recognize it as a foreign antigen and mount immune response. So to counter that, what they've done that prior to the experiment, they have exposed some of the mice with the ovalbumin, and this exposure to food antigen will lead to development of tolerance to that antigen in the mice. So even in mice with with established tolerance, they found that the results did not change. The same results were replicated. What does this imply? This implies that this infection is leading to breakdown of the previously established tolerance to this food antigen. And another small experiment, what they've done was they have replaced this ovalbumin with bovine serum albumin, and they found that the results were not recapitulated. So injection of giving bovine serum albumin, which is a different antigen compared to the primary antigen exposed antigen, did not result in development of VHS. This implies that the development of VHS is antigen specific. So now that we have established the generation of local immune response and development of visceral hypersensitivity in in mice who have developed diarrhea after infection. So now coming to studying mucosal permeability. So how did they study mucosal permeability? So they've isolated, after the mice were euthanized, they've isolated freshly isolated colonic tissue with intact seromuscular layer was mounted on a special chamber called Using chamber. So this is the serosal surface and this is the mucosal surface. So in an open circuit condition, they continuously measure the trans epithelial electrical resistance. So along with the resistance, what they will pass sodium fluorescein salt from mucosal side to serosal side, and with a special fluorescence reader they will quantify how much the salt is passing through this membrane. So this is nothing but the fluorescent salt passage, and this is the resistance. What are the findings? So the same four groups: ova sham with ova infected with saline, ova infected with ova, and this is the VHS mice. Subsequently, we'll be calling these as VHS mice, and all these three groups as normosensitive mice, because in these there was no visceral hypersensitivity. Only in this model there was visceral hypersensitivity. So in VHS mice, there was increased passage of fluorescein from mucosal to serosal layer, indicating there was increased mucosal permeability compared to the other three groups. Not just that, there was the resistance also was low in the VHS mice. So this establishes the fact of increased mucosal permeability. So we know that low-grade inflammation can persist in the mucosa, and this can contribute to the pathophysiology of IBS. To study the fact, in the biopsies of these four groups, the same four group, this is the VHS mice and this is the normosensitive mice. They have compared the histology. They have compared the muscle thickness, length, crypts length, distance between the crypts. So the biopsy, there were no biopsy differences. So histopathological differences were not there. Not just that, they have isolated the colonic supernatant and estimated the values of all these cytokines, but no significant differences were found between the two groups. Even in the colon draining lymph nodes, there was no difference in the interleukin levels. So what they've done is that they have prepared single cell suspensions from the biopsy supernatants, and in that single cell suspensions they have performed immunofluorescence study. So in these immunofluorescence studies to identify CD markers and also different leukocytes infiltration in the uh, mucosal tissue, they did not find any difference. So what they said is that mild colonic inflammation during acute infectious phase was observed, which I did not show. All these changes were 7 weeks post infection. So after the acute infection has resolved, this is after the over re-exposure. There was not much difference in the four groups. So they concluded that inflammation resolved in the VHS and normosensitive infected mice, ruling out that this is contributing to VHS. So what is the role of immunoglobulin E? So this is the experimental protocol which I've shown in the beginning. So just to recapitulate, this is the infection, this is the primary food exposure, this is the re-exposure. Here we found that when mice infected with this bacterium, given this antigen, when they were re-exposed to CM antigen, developed VHS. So for these mice, what they've done was they have injected intraperitoneally monoclonal anti-IgE antibody. So they have given intraperitoneally once weekly once weekly for 3 weeks. And what they found was this antiglobulin, this prevented the development of VHS. So establishing the fact that IgE was a pivotal molecule which played an important role in development of VHS, and it was prevented by anti-IgE antibody. And interleukin 4 was required for production of allergen specific IgE by plasma cells after the re-exposure to antigen. So they found that these interleukin 4s were also high. Interleukin 4 containing lymphocytes were high in the lymph nodes draining colon of VHS mice. So coming to the role of gut microbiota, so they have analyzed the gut microbiota in all the four groups. They found that OVA exposure during infection resulted in a shift of community structure of intestinal microbiome, and there was some dysbiosis. There was change in the composition, and what are the reasons for the change? Robinsonella and Eisenbergiella. These were the two genera which were strongest drivers of this dysbiosis. However, this dysbiosis did not significantly affect VHS. Why am I saying this? What they've done is in the same protocol, they have given an antibiotic cocktail treatment. In this, they have given amoxicillin plus neomycin plus metronidazole, and they have observed whether these mice will develop VHS. So this antibiotic cocktail treatment did not prevent development of VHS. So see here we can see. So this is the visceromotor response on the x-axis. On the y-axis, this is the timeline. So here is the re-exposure. Here we expect that so this dark shaded part is the VHS VHS. These two are the VHS mice. So here they have split into two groups. One of them is treated with vehicle. One of them is treated with placebo. One of them is treated with antibiotic. So we can see that irrespective of whether they're treated with antibiotic or placebo, there is increase in the visceromotor response. So antibiotic did not really prevent VHS. The same thing with the distension volume in the x-axis. So there was no difference. So this implied that there was no significant correlation between VHS and gut dysbiosis. So what is the role of mast cells? So they have taken they have done a genetic analysis, and what they found was, so these are the four groups. So here the darkly shaded is the VHS mice, and the other three are the uh, control groups. So here these two are important. These two groups are important here because this is OVA infected mice who are re-exposed to either saline or re-exposed to antigen. So initial antigen exposure is common in these two groups. In these two groups, they found that there was upregulation of this gene. What is this gene? This is the mask. This represents codes for mast cell restricted tryptase activity, indirectly implying that there is mast cell activation. So these two groups where the primary OVA exposure has resulted in mast cell activation, but not in the other two groups. So they concluded that the mast cell activation was there in regardless of the OVA re-exposure status, and subsequently they also measured the degranulation. So this is the intensity of the mast cell. So we can see that in the fourth group there is decreased in the mast cells because they have degranulated. So the percentage of degranulated mast cells have increased. So this led to the hypothesis that mast cells were activated or sensitized during the primary exposure of antigen, and re-exposure has resulted in degranulation of mast cells. So to prove the same fact, they have used mast cell stabilizer doxantrozole. So here the timeline and visceromotor response using doxantrozole has resulted in has prevented development of visceral hypersensitivity, reduced visceromotor response, and not just that, genetic ablation of mast cells. This is the genetic ablated model that has also shown that the VHS was reduced, and the same result was also found when the mice were B cell depleted using bortezomib, which is an anti-CD20 antibody. So here I've explained the role of IgE, role of mast cells, and now moving on to understand altered pain perception. So we know that the colonic splanchnic nerves are responsible for pain sensation to visceral pain sensation to colorectal distension. So what they found was in mice experiments, mechanical stimulation led to higher action potential discharge in VHS mice compared to the normosensitive mice. So VHS mice had visceral nerves which are definitely more sensitive. Not just that, not just to mechanical stimulation, but these nerves were these nerves were more sensitive to even the colonic supernatant from VHS mice. Now, what is this? So we have understood that in VHS mice, the exposure to the food antigen led to immune activation, resulting in mast cell degranulation and more histamine. So we have postulated that in the biopsy supernatant, we expect more amount of histamine. So this histamine, we are anticipating that this histamine is responsible for activation of the nerve terminals and increased pain response. So with this hypothesis, uh, they found that the colonic supernatant from VHS mice, and which is expected to contain a lot of histamine, resulted in increased neuronal excitability and increased dorsal root ganglion neuron sensitivity to caspase, which is a TRPV1 agonist. So all this increased pain perception was prevented by pyrilamine, which is a H1 receptor antagonist, which blocks the action of histamine on the visceral nerves. So not just in mice model, they found that the pyrilamine reduced pain response to colorectal distension. So this is the pyrilamine reduction in the visceral hypersensitivity. Even the genetic model, they have ablated the histamine receptor and they saw that there was no visceral hypersensitivity. So coming to a specific entity called super antigen, what the authors have proposed is that there are some super antigen means that the antigen which cause non-specific stimulation of T cells. These were first described in models of allergic rhinitis. So what happened was that in allergic rhinitis and atopy, they found that in the respiratory mucosa, these colonization with bacteria resulted in super antigens which have uh, stimulated local immune response that resulted in increased airway reactivity. So what they postulated was that can ingestion of these super antigens during acute rhinitis or the super antigens generated by gut microbiome, can these lead to activate local immune response? So what they did was they have taken staphylococcal enterotoxin B. This is an example of super antigen, and they've exposed the mice to ova in the presence of SEB. Instead of the Citrobacter rodentium infection, they have now used a toxin. So use of toxin has resulted in the same changes, that is development of visceral hypersensitivity and also increase in colonic permeability on ovary exposure. So whether it is a Clostridium rodentium infection or whether it is exposure to a staphylococcal toxin kind of thing, the changes are same. So even in the SCB VHS mice, they found that the gene for mast cell activity and the interleukins were upregulated, and these were prevented by the mast cell stabilizer. implying that the same mechanism of mast cell mediated mechanism. And here again, there is only local immune response, not a systemic response. And an interesting finding is that they found that the super antigen producing bacteria, for example, these are the two main bacteria, Staph aureus and Streptococcus pyogenes. So the prevalence of these bacteria in the IBS patients, it was high. So, for example, Staph aureus, there compared to healthy volunteers, 23% of IBS patients compared to 9% of healthy volunteers were colonized with Staph aureus, and 47% of patients with IBS were positive for at least one of the super antigens. Like those of them who were positive IBS patients who had Staphylococcus aureus, at least 47% had at least one super antigen. So super antigens might be involved in initiation of visceral hypersensitivity in subsets of patients with IBS.
Jatin,
Sir,
you are presenting single article, two articles.
sir, two article, but the second is I'll be only giving the brief overview, sir.
Okay, because you have already consumed 40 minutes.
Sir, yes, sir. Sir, just 5 minutes closing.
Jatin, it's very important in Journal Club that every experiment done by the authors may not be presented because nobody have will able to understand. Your main message will be missed. So
Sure.
always focus, speak for 10 minutes, 15 minutes or so, discuss that.
Yes, sir. So coming to the human studies, so I'll skip the patient characteristics.
Don't skip. This is important. Don't skip, please.
Sir,
It is
yes.
important.
Sir, they have taken 12 patients with IBS and 8 healthy volunteers for food antigen injection experiment. So the characteristics of 12 patients is presented here. Majority are diarrhea predominant. Only 2 of them are not diarrhea predominant, and only 2 out of 12 had a history of infection. Majority are female, and mean age was 29, and the median VAS pain score is 5.5, and 9 out of 12 patients had associated psychological distress, and all of these IBS patients do not have any food antigen specific immunoglobulin, so they do not have any systemic allergy to these antigens, and the median time between development of pain from food was 30 minutes to 3 hours, and so these are the reported symptoms which they developed after the food intake. So what they've done was they've done a sigmoidoscopy in these patients with IBS injection, and they've diluted the antigens and they've injected into the mucosa. So after injection, after 12 minutes after injection, they observed the reaction, and they found that there was development of edema in patients with histamine injection. So histamine is in a positive control. We expect that there is mucosal edema to this. So in healthy volunteer, injecting food antigens into the mucosa did not result in development of mucosal edema. But in IBS patients, injection of food antigen, for example, milk in this case, resulted in development of significant mucosal edema. So this saline is a negative control and histamine is a positive control, where obviously there is mucosal edema. And they've compared 4 different antigens, and they've found that there was no edema in healthy volunteer group, but all the antigens resulted in development of mucosal edema in patients with IBS. So all 12 patients with IBS showed mucosal reaction to at least one of the food antigen, and only 2 out of 8 healthy volunteers showed single positive reaction. So this implies that IBS patients have increased local immune response to the food antigens compared to healthy volunteers. So they've measured the mast cell tryptase activity in the biopsy supernatant. They found that before antigen injection, the number of mast cells and IgA mast cells, positive mast cells, were similar in both the groups. volunteers and IBS patients, but the tryptase activity, which is a proxy for mast cell degranulation, was higher in IBS patients compared to the healthy volunteers. After injection of food antigen, the tryptase activity was higher, which is expected, and this is a protein serine protease inhibitor, which inhibits the mast cell activity, which they have showed that this inhibitor did not lead to development of edema. So they have done immunoflow. They have taken the from the site of injection itself after 12 minutes after observing the edema. They have taken biopsies and subjected them to immunofluorescence staining. So the blue part is the nucleus, and the green part represents the mark cell, which is a CD117 marker, and the red part represents the beta tubulin, which represents the neuron. So what they've done is they've measured the distance between the mast cells and the neurons. So the interesting finding was that the distance between the IgE positive mast cells and the nerve fibers was smaller in IBS. That means these mast cells tend to be migrating towards the neurons, and the distance between the uh, so this is the distance, and this is the so the distance was smaller in patients with IBS. That means they are closer to the nerves, and not just that, the abdominal pain scores were also inversely correlating with the distance between the mast cell and the neurons. The closer the mast cells to the neuron, the increased pain score. They also found that the intensity of IgE in these mast cells was high in patients with IBS, and this IgE intensity positively correlated with severity of pain abdomen and the diameter of mucosal edema. So this series of experiments provides us new insights into the pathophysiology of IBS. We know that oral tolerance is important for maintenance of homeostasis, and infection can break the oral tolerance to food antigens and lead to development of VHS in immunologically susceptible patients. So the genetic makeup can also contribute to the development of VHS. So we've understood that this is a local immune response rather than a systemic food allergy, and local IgE antibodies are involved in the food-induced abdominal pain. This is we can draw a similar analogy to airway hyperreactivity in allergic rhinitis patients. So we can now start looking at this as with a different perspective. So these are all food-induced uh, food-induced disorders which are mediated by mast cell activation, where on one end, in a mild end, there is IBS, where there is only a local immune response, and towards the other end, there is a systemic food allergy, where there is even systemic also. So IBS, to support the same fact, IBS is known to be associated with other atopic conditions also. So this is the proposed hypothesis and the conclusion slide. So in steady state, there is oral tolerance to food antigen, and when there is bacterial infection or there is exposure to bacterial toxins, this tolerance to food antigens is lost, resulting in stimulation of beta cells, production of immunoglobulins, and these immunoglobulins go and activate the mast cells, and these activated mast cells sit there for long duration of time, and when the patient is re-exposed to the same antigen which was exposed during the index infection, these mast cells get degranulated immediately, and these resulting in histamine and mediators stimulate the nerve terminals in the visceral nerves, and that result in increased visceral hypersensitivity. So why is this important? So this provides us opportunity to develop new therapeutic targets. For example, they found that patients with severe asthma who were treated with omalizumab, in those patients, the symptoms of IBS have decreased. So tyrosine kinase inhibitor can be used to block the mast cell degranulation, and H1 receptor antagonists like Avastin can be used to block the neuronal sensitization. So these are the various levels where the potential therapeutic targets can be developed in various steps, like mast cell sensitization by IgE can be blocked, mast cell activation and degranulation can be blocked, H1 receptor mediated neurosensitization can also be blocked. So this is one example. This is a proof of concept study, a small clinical randomized placebo controlled trial, where they found that the H1 receptor mediated neuronal sensitization was blocked by H1 receptor antagonist. So they found that they reduced visceral hypersensitivity symptoms and also abdominal pain in patients with IBS. So,
I think good presentation. Basically, the treatment of IBS has always been an enigma, and in this study, the authors have shown that in the mice, when they're exposed to antigen, when they're simultaneously exposed to antigen during infection, they develop hypersensitivity, and re-exposure to the antigen later leads to symptoms. In that they have increased mast cells, increased histamine, increased IgE, suggesting an allergy-mediated allergy-mediated response, which is responsible for the symptoms. So, as Jatin has suggested, this experiment gives us an opportunity to treat these patients by using anti-allergic methods like anti-IgE, mast cell stabilizers, mast cell degranulation inhibitors. These can be used in the future, and these drugs can be developed in the future to treat the IBS patient. And now I open the house for any questions and any clarifications they need.
Jatin, Shrikant here.
sir,
Sir, I had one question. Whether, like, from what you have shown, are you trying to say that IBS is basically a food allergy? Just a very broadly, are you trying to say that?
yes, sir. In short, you can say that the antigens which is this is one of the in the multiple pathways involved in the IBS. This is one of the inciting events. Like infection can be an inciting event, and food can act as an antigen.
Okay. So I have two questions. Whether IgE has been ever seen in serum to be increased in patients with IBS? Has it been seen? Maybe you have read up. Like, is IgE higher? And secondly, is there then after this proof of concept study, is there any role of allergy testing for foodstuffs in IBS? Which is, I don't think it has been shown to be useful, but do you think it would be useful after this proof of concept?
So they have clearly shown that this is not this is very different from systemic food allergy. So in systemic food allergy, if someone is allergic to food, if we draw the blood samples, they'll have elevated IgE. But in this, what they have clearly shown is that this increased allergic reaction is restricted only to the colonic mucosa or the site of infection, and this is not spilling over into the systemic circulation, or neither the patient will develop any systemic reaction. That is why I don't think skin prick test like we do in other allergic tests will be helpful in identifying patients. That's why they have injected locally into the mucosa of colorectal mucosa and look for response.
Srikant, this study is one of the beginning of a new concept
Yes.
that there is a food antigen which can lead to some kind of sensitization.
Yes.
And we know for sure that the GI tract is always challenged with different kind of food and food antigen, and they react in some way, and there is some symptom will occur, either diarrhea or pain, right? The point here is there's something which is a vessel hypersensitivity, and then there's a stimuli with any food antigen, and this may be local reaction. There may not be IgE level present in the blood. So those who have IgE level present, it means there's a constant activity. So person taking food today, and so IgE will go away. IgE will go away in some time. It won't persist. But those who have IgE levels, that means there's persistent food antigen related allergy, and therefore IgE levels remains high sometimes. So that's one point. Second point, the most of the food allergy tests available, unfortunately, they are IgG based. So IgG food antigen against milk or wheat or whatever. So IgG level based food tests have no value in clinical practice, and they have been. Most society would say that this is not to be done. Very few tests are available which are IgE level based, where again, if you do 100 food antigen, there will be 20 positive. And how do we go about it? Which food antigen is responsible for symptoms? So this is always an important that a patient should find out which particular food leads to symptom genesis, and that particular food may be avoided. In IBS, food is very important. Food induced symptom is very, very important. Now, this study has further given all the basic physiology why it happens.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
And as Jatin and Jatin and Varun said, that this may open a new vista for new therapy, at new research in this field, which is totally neglected, like functional GI disorders, totally neglected in terms of science. But such a study will certainly put a lot of interest into this, and certainly it will lead to more pharmaceutical drug investigation in this regards.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
But I think I'll urge that everyone should read this article in Nature. It's not difficult to read. There's a summary of 3-4 pages, and then there's 7-8 pages of methodology. It is read summary yourself. You can read your phone. It's a beautiful article and beautiful to read, not only for the science part of it, but also the way article are to be described in short. Each experiment which Jatin showed, just 3 liners, 3 lines, one full experiment, which could be one full paper. For us, each experiment is full paper, and in this, they all have been condensed to 3 line description. It's a beautiful article to read for that purpose also, that how to write a good paper.
If there are no further questions, Jatin, move on to the second article. Present it in.
Sir, since there is paucity of time, can I just present the important findings for?
Yeah,
Sir?
Yes.
Present the important findings.
So the second article was published in Gastroenterology, the title of which is Proton Pump Inhibitors Reduce Duodenal Eosinophilia, Mast Cells, and also permeability in patients with functional dyspepsia. So this was from the same group, same institute, but from a different group of people. So I'll skip the background of it. So what was the hypothesis? We know that functional dyspepsia, the first line of treatment is PPI. But what is the mechanism of PPI in treating functional dyspepsia? They have hypothesized that duodenal eosinophilia is the pathophysiological mechanism and can be a treatment target for functional dyspepsia. So
one thing, let's
Sir.
go back to this point. So this is a misnomer here.
Sir.
So what is duodenal eosinophilia? What people do that in functional dyspepsia, you take duodenal biopsy,
Yes, sir.
and duodenal biopsy show there is eosinophils count, and you describe the duodenal eosinophilia.
Sir.
But somebody has eosinophilia, then they might be diffused. Many other part of GI tract may have eosinophilia. There may be eosinophilia in the different part of stomach. There may be eosinophilia in the different part of small intestine.
Yes, sir.
Right? Just keep in mind that it's not limited to only duodenum, but in studies it was seen in duodenum because in functional dyspepsia you do endoscopy and take due to biopsy or D1 biopsy.
Yes, sir.
Therefore, but if this patient can also have eosinophilia in other site of GI tract.
Yes, sir. So the aims of the study were to confirm duodenal mucosal inflammation and increase permeability in patients with functional dyspepsia, to evaluate the role of other duodenal and mucosal and luminal and systemic factors, and to assess whether the PPI has any effect on all these factors which contribute to functional dyspepsia, and to study the association of PPI related changes in clinical outcomes with the duodenal and systemic factors. What are these duodenal systemic factors? I'll be telling you. So this is also from the same university, which the first article I've presented. So they have included patients with, they have again taken healthy volunteers as well as functional dyspepsia patients. So this was Rome 3, sorry. And the intervention, they have given pantoprazole 40 mg OD for 4 weeks. And the control they've taken as healthy volunteers. Outcomes I'll be discussing. So what they've done was they have taken a questionnaire based study for the clinical symptoms, like physician assisted global GI symptom score, which is a 20-point score, and they've graded from 0 to 5. And they've also taken a perceived stress score, so 10-point score, and they've labeled it. So these are the stress scoring and clinical symptom scoring. And they have done a biopsy after endoscopy, and the biopsy was stored for permeability testing in a different solutions. After the biopsy was done, they have aspirated the duodenal fluid also, and they have measured the pH. So what they've done was, when the patient initially comes, they've placed a duodenal tube, and after 1 hour, they have given a liquid meal here, calorie dense liquid meal, and they have at 4 different time points, they have taken duodenal aspirates. So these represent the fed samples, and initial samples were discarded because there would be contamination from the uh, gastric contents. So this represents, after 1 hour of fasting, this represents the first fasting sample. After the meal is given, 3 fed samples. So to simplify, I have given a line diagram. So they are taken 2 groups. So one is the healthy volunteers, and other is the patients with functional dyspepsia who were started on PPI. So both of them are started on PPI here. So the inclusion criteria was that both of these groups should not have had exposure to PPI, standard dose PPI, in the last 3 months prior to recruitment. And the another group of refractory functional dyspepsia,
It's 5 o'clock.
Those patients who were on PPI for 4 weeks and did not have any response, here they have stopped PPI, and they followed these patients for further 8 weeks. So all of these previous, the biopsy, fluid aspirate, pH measurement, and symptom measurement, these were all clinical procedures were done at 2 points, before and after PPI stoppage in patients with refractory functional dyspepsia, and before and after starting PPI in FD and HV. So these are termed as starters, where we are starting the PPI. These are called stoppers because we are stopping in refractory. So these are the time points where the studies were conducted. So coming to experiments, the mucosal permeability, as I've explained in the first article, they have used the same Using chamber, and they have measured the electrical resistance and passage of the fluorescein. Instead of salt, here there is fluorescein dextran, which passes from the mucosal to serosal surface. So this one I have described previously. They have also performed the immunohistochemistry on the duodenal D2 biopsy. H&E stain was used to demonstrate duodenal and eosinophil counting, and also intraepithelial lymphocyte counting, c-Kit staining for mast cells. They've also measured bile salts with liquid chromatography, tandem mass spectrometry. So what are the results? They've included 79 subjects, 30 patients with healthy volunteers, 30 patients who were started on on PPI, which are FD starters, and 19 refractory FD patients who were stopped, whose PPI was stopped. So after the exclusion of 3 and 1 in these 2 groups, ultimately these were the groups where the complete results were available. So the baseline characteristics were comparable between both the groups. The mean age was around 31, and majority of them were female, and majority of them were postprandial distress subtype. 54% of them were PDA subtype, and similar alcohol and smoking status was there. So what are the key findings in this experiment? Compared to patients with the functional dyspepsia and healthy volunteers, both of whom were started on PPI, so this off PPI means the baseline before starting PPI, and this is after 4 weeks of PPI. So what they found was the clinical symptom score. Obviously in patients with functional dyspepsia, it was higher, and in duodenal local factors, what all they have studied. In the mucosa, they have studied the concentration of eosinophils, mast cell infiltration, and lymphocyte infiltration. And the mucosal permeability also they have studied. In systemic factors, to study inflammation, they have taken HSCRP. To study gut mucosal translocation, they have taken lipopolysaccharide binding protein. And as a we know that stress plays an important role in patients with functional GI disorder. So perceived stress score. So the key findings were that at baseline, before starting PPI, in patients with functional dyspepsia compared to healthy volunteers, there was higher clinical score. There was increased eosinophil and mast cell infiltration, but not intraepithelial lymphocytes. And there was also increased permeability, and there was increased HSCRP when compared to healthy volunteers. And there was also increased perceived stress score, but there was no increase in the LBP. So these were a comparison at the baseline. What is the response to PPI? As expected, there was decrease in the symptoms, there was decrease in the eosinophils, and there was decrease in mast cells. Permeability also decreased, CRP decreased, but perceived stress score did not change much with PPI. So the same
Jatin,
sir,
Jatin, just go back.
sir.
This is very interesting observation here. That eosinophil count 331 plus minus 16, 17 means no standard deviation, very little standard deviation. And also on follow-up, there's a drop and no standard deviation. Mast cells again 470, very small deviation, standard deviation, less than 5%. And so is in follow-up. It means this is very homogeneous. In all 24 patients or whatever, 20, 22 patients, the changes were uniform and homogeneous. This is very unique in biology, and if it is present, it has a distinct value. Because otherwise, what happens is eosinophil count will vary from 300, and this one is 150, 160, or even 300. It means some there's increase, some there's no increase. It looks like every patient had a high eosinophil count, and every patient a high mast cells count, and there's a uniform response in terms of whatever intervention done, that there's a decrease in the numbers. It's very unique, and such kind of finding make you think this is a truthful truthful observation. I mean, this is very unique. We don't find such a finding in biology,
Yes,
but
sir.
it's very unique.
So,
Right.
so this was the summary of all the changes, all the parameters which they have observed, and the changes with the PPI treatment. So I've described them individually. So these are all the same findings. Can I skip this and go to
Yeah, please do
discussion?
that.
So interesting finding is that we know that there was increase in the mast cells, eosinophils, but no change in intraepithelial lymphocytes. There was increase in permeability, and all these changes we now know. But what has happened with PPI? They have done correlation studies. So what they found, but there was no correlation between clinical outcomes and change in the mast cells or mucosal permeability, all other luminal factors like pH or bile salts, or systemic factors like HSCRP or perceived stress. All these factors, change in all these factors did not correlate with the clinical response to PPI. What is the only thing which is correlated with the PPI, correlated with the clinical positive clinical outcome with PPI, is the change in the eosinophil count. So that led to the hypothesis that the mechanism of PPI is reduction of eosinophils. So, but what is the mechanism by which the PPI reduced eosinophils? That is unknown, but one of the proposed hypothesis is that PPI can inhibit eotoxin 3 expression via STAT6, and there is a need to for exploration of pathways and eosinophil mast cell axis in patients with functional dyspepsia. So what the duodenal barrier barrier permeability may be altered with either luminal acid or bile salts, which lead to antigen penetration and inflammation in the mucosa. So the changes in the bile salt receptors and signaling may play a role in functional dyspepsia and needs further studies. So what is the implication given that the duodenal eosinophilia may be pathophysiological mechanism and treatment target for PPIs? A targeted anti-inflammatory rather than symptom-based treatment should be explored in functional dyspepsia. And the association between PPI changes in duodenal eosinophilia and symptoms in functional dyspepsia, they do not prove any causality, and further study of the underlying mediators or confounding factors which change both eosinophil and clinical symptoms is needed. So,
Again, go back to this.
sir,
I don't think we'll call it limitation of the study.
sir,
So what you say that this is a way forward,
yes, sir.
right? So one should be careful while doing journal club that we must give all the due respect to the authors. They never wanted to answer this question. They had a defined objective, they have defined question, and they answer the question, right? So they are the further on. So we require more studies to take this story further,
Yes, sir.
rather than limitation. Limitation is a word we'll use for in the study what could they have done
Yes,
and they didn't do.
yes, sir.
Right.
So this is the conclusion slide. Just to summarize, they've taken 30 patients in both functional dyspepsia and functional dyspepsia in healthy volunteers, and they have given pantoprazole 4-week standard OD dose. And what they found was that there was decrease in the symptoms. There is no change in the stress levels, and there was some change in the cortisol level, and there was obviously increase in the pHs with pH with PPI, but there was no change in the bile salts. So this led to conclusion that in patients with functional dyspepsia, change in eosinophils led to clinical efficacy, uh, suggesting eosinophil reducing effects of PPI rather than acid reducing effects of PPI, which is responsible for clinical response. Another finding in that in healthy controls who were PPI refractory, giving PPI resulted in increased eosinophils. That they have shown because increased pH and increased bile salts was responsible for mucosal effect. So they have also given a possible statement that we should stop PPI in patients with refractory functional dyspepsia. So if there are any questions.
Any questions anybody has? Maybe let me ask one question. Say, calling these patients who didn't respond to PPI, calling them healthy volunteer, do you agree with that?
No, sir, they are not healthy volunteers. Sir. Healthy volunteers were did not have any symptoms, did not have any prior exposure to PPI. There were 3 different.
But they underwent endoscopy.
They
They underwent endoscopy.
Yes, sir. So there were 3 different groups, sir. These were FD stoppers, these were FD starters, and healthy volunteers. The 3 different groups. So
in healthy volunteers, endoscopy was done, and
yes, sir, endoscopy was done.
Okay.
Srikanth here.
Sir.
I had one point. Sir, like there was previously the entity of PPI responsive eosinophilic esophagitis. It has now been clubbed into eosinophilic esophagitis because they have shown that it is actually early stage and PPI is a therapy for eosinophilic. So do you think that functional dyspepsia may also be an early spectrum of eosinophilic GI disease? Considering this, just a thought, like that whether eosinophil decrease is also leading to clinical efficacy. Could it be an early spectrum of eosinophilic disease?
So the reason why this hypothesis was generated is also based on the studies from eosinophilic esophagitis. I have not mentioned in the slide, but they have derived the this concept, copied this concept from response to PPI in eosinophilic esophagitis. So it is probably, as Sir said, they have studied in the duodenum. Similarly, eosinophils can be present elsewhere in the GI tract and lead to different manifestations. If they are present in esophagus, and that can lead to eosinophilic esophagitis. If in duodenum, then the duodenogastric changes like functional dyspepsia.
Srikanth, this field is still evolving, and is all because of super expertise. That if you are a specialist with interest in esophagus, so you take esophageal biopsies and find, okay, there are a lot of eosinophils in esophagus, and you name as a EOE. Somebody working in duodenum will say it's a duodenal eosophilia. Somebody working in stomach will say it's a gastric eosophilia. Somebody working in the small intestine will take 10 biopsy from different sites of the small intestine, say this is a small intestine, or say it's a colon. But ultimately, if there is one site of disease and you will biopsy from different segment of intestine and say that no, there's only esophageal, no other site of GI tract which are reachable by endoscopy has dystrophilia. Unfortunately, that part is we are not looking at from that holistic view. We are looking at very narrow view in looking at one organ. But eosinophil is one white cell which may infiltrate various part of GI tract, and there may be a different pathophysiology. For example, the same patient, what is the mechanism of patient having eosinophilic esophagitis? Can the same patient have a duodenal eosinophilia or gastric eosinophilia? I think somehow I predict or suspect that many patients, not all, but many patients can have a one unifying antigen, which leads to uh, which leads to infiltration or what we call the cytokine, some kind of chemokine release, which leads to eosinophilic secretion and then infiltration into different part of GI tract. And really also wonder that if food antigen is the cause of eosinophilic esophagitis, the exposure of esophagus is just minimal by food, because the whole transit is 10 seconds. In 10 seconds time, the whole food or food bolus passes from cryptopharynx to down to the stomach. Is 10 seconds time is good enough time to excite the local innate immune response? So I wonder that, is it true or it is something else? What we require is a more prolonged immune activation, therefore a persistent rise, because it's not about that, it's what eosinophils would come there and infiltrate. So they will take time for blood vessels to come and then infiltrate into the mucosa, and they persist for months together. So therefore I wonder that the food related, what we call the food related esophagitis is the right hypothesis. There may be more to it. Most likely it's more permanent, something which is more continuous, like what happens in celiac disease and what happens in IBD. More continuous or persistent antigenic challenge and leading to infiltration by these cells.
Sir, if there are no further questions, let's close this session. Anybody has any further questions?
But a good journal club, very good articles, and in fact very thought-provoking articles. And it has I think sure that the science in this regards will have more science in this regards, and certainly new drugs are likely to come. Right, wonderful.